Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our How to Work with People series, The Art of Supportive Leadership, Swami Kriyananda's book. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to understand your deep teaching, to absorb it in every part of our being, that it becomes our spontaneous and natural way of living in this world, that everywhere we look, we see your guiding hand. In every pair of eyes, we see your shining presence. Teach us to be your instruments of wisdom and unconditional love and eternal bliss in all that we do. Om. Peace. Amen. After the class was over yesterday, after the session was over yesterday, I realized that I was making a word mistake, and words are very important since words is what we're dealing with here. It was odd. While I was talking, I knew that there was sort of something over here that was trying to get my attention. I couldn't quite see it. And it had to do with my talking about the subconscious, the conscious, and superconscious. And then I started talking about impulses that we feel inside ourselves that are really coming from the subconscious. I kept calling them subconscious intuition, which is a little bit oxymoronic because the nature of intuition is that it comes from a higher source and that it's a revealed truth. At least that's how we use the word. So the word I was looking for was guidance. We often, inner guidance, we often give a program that has the very clear and excellent title, How to Know and Trust Your Inner Guidance. So in that context, what I was talking about is that your subconscious mind is you, it is your inner self, and it's insisting on a certain course of action. And its inner guidance, which, as I was explaining yesterday, for people who are completely accustomed to being utterly passive in their lives and letting everyone else make their decisions for them, even to assert subconscious guidance is a step forward, because at least it's claiming your individuality, it's having the courage to make decisions according to your own lights, whatever they might be. But it's not the same as superconscious guidance. But using the word intuition instead of guidance was a little confusing, so I really wanted to clarify it. Everything that I said was exactly valid. It was just a little confusing to bring the word intuition into a subconscious realm. That I didn't really mean to do that. I didn't really intend to do that. Okay, so now where we were, and let me think where I can come to. Just give me a moment. Oh, I was talking about, yes, even sometimes when your intuition is valid, it can be messed up with ego. That was the point where I left it, and I wanted to just give a few examples of that before I go back to the next paragraph in Swami's book. I had a completely dramatic experience of that. Oh, many years ago. It would have been now like, it would have been like 30 years ago. But it was very vivid, and it's always stayed with me. I was involved in a project that involved quite a few other people, had a lot of implications. It wasn't like my own personal art that I could just do my own way and it didn't matter. It was very much of a group project. I was one of the leaders, but by no means the only leader in the group. We had to make a decision about what we should do going forward. And there were lots of objective considerations, common sense considerations that Swami talks about, and they were all this and that. And somewhere in the middle of that, I had a powerful flash of superconscious intuition, which comes to me sometimes, but not by any means all the time, and not so often that it's commonplace. But I just had an intuitive flash of exactly what we ought to do. So I told everyone that I knew what we ought to do, and this was what it was. And it was one of the choices, but by no means the universal pick. But I'd had intuitive insight, and that was that. But what happened was then I began, and other people didn't immediately accept my insight, and I began to push. And I began to push in a way that was not calm and centered and detached. It became an ego issue with me that I was going to get my way. My intuition, I believe, and events bore it out, was superconscious and correct. But my way of expressing it, I began to wrap it all up in my ego and created a tremendous amount of ill will and confusion and pushback, and I did not handle the situation well, to the point where I finally realized that I just needed to absent myself from the process because I just made such a hash of it. So I wrote, probably it was emails by that point, I wrote emails to everyone and said, even if my intuition was correct, because I couldn't repudiate the experience, even if my intuition was correct, the way I have expressed it has completely corrupted whatever superconscious energy there was there. So I'm going to absent myself from this decision-making process and simply let all of you decide. So I did. I dropped out completely. And in a matter of a week or two, they made exactly the decision that I had recommended right from the start. And I'm not saying that because, oh, gee, look what a great person I was. But it was true superconscious intuition. But I totally made it impossible for anybody to feel the superconscious energy because all I was giving them was ego. And they were perfectly correct to reject me. So, of course, I learned from that. Just because it has a high origin doesn't mean that that gives you the right to be a complete brat, or to disregard other people, or to disrespect them, or to demand that, after all, I have an intuition. Other people have a perfect right to intuition. It was sort of a joke when these two men, Haridas and Vijay, at the time were young monks. Swami sent them to Sacramento, and this would be about 1978, from Ananda village to start an Ananda center there. It was the first time we started a center outside of Ananda village. And Haridas and Vijay are both very colorful characters, strong-minded, creative men. And after working together for even for a year or two, they came to the interesting conclusion that there can be two such things as God's will. And they can be mutually exclusive one from another, because both of them would become set that this is what God wants us to do. And interestingly, they were completely contradictory. And there's actually truth in that, because intuition may be personal, or it may belong to everyone. Or if you're going to make the decision, this is the right decision for you to make, but it might not be the right decision for someone else to make, because it's very, very sensitive. And the other way that people mess up superconscious intuition is God says to go north. I'm supposed to go north. And as Swami often says, we dogmatize that. We take, see, the very nature of superconsciousness is that its vibration is very refined, and it's also very responsive and constantly creative. The nature of the material plane in the conscious mind is it wants to fix everything and know just what we're supposed to do. So you may get a true superconscious intuition, and Swami always uses this example, the intuition is to go north, so you head north, but now your dogma has become not that I will remain ever receptive and attuned to superconscious intuition. Now my dogma has become go north. And perhaps we're only supposed to go north for 1 kilometer. And then the next guidance is going to be go due east. But my intuition said I'm supposed to go north. And so it could have been true. But how we work with it determines whether or not it remains true. And also intuition is like, it's something that will take us toward a higher reality. But if we make it an instrument, a blunt instrument of our egoic will, then it's not taking us to higher realities anymore. So the whole dynamic shifts. In this moment, what was true in that moment might not be true anymore because of how we have worked with it. And one of the ways, as Swami talks about in here, that you should not work with your superconscious intuition is to use it as an instrument of power over other people. Even just by that very definition, you can see this is not what it's for. I was more recently, this was like more recently than 30 years ago, it was like 20 years ago. I also was in a situation where I received an extremely strong intuition, again, of a character that has come to me occasionally but is not regular. And I really felt we should do something, and the we involved all of Ananda. And I wasn't alone in my understanding that this was what I felt we were being guided to do, but it was certainly a divisive subject. And people, and Swami was involved, and Swami was very amazing during this particular one. Whenever someone would call him extremely alarmed about what was going on, he would say, "I understand why you feel that way." And he did. He did understand why they felt that way. And he remained quite neutral. He just sort of let us battle this one out. But finally it reached the point where it was so controversial that we called him up and said, "Sir, maybe what do you really think?" Because I'd never really said if I should do it. I'd never asked him in such a way that he could give me a fully honest answer. I asked him with a predisposition for a certain answer. So I asked him with a totally open. He said, "It's very good that you should ask." And then he started talking about the pros and cons. And then it was very interesting. And he started saying, this could happen, this bad thing could happen, that bad thing could happen, this bad thing could happen. I said, "Oh, sir, none of those things are going to happen." And then I said what I hadn't said to him before. I said, "Swamiji, this idea came to me," and I just used a phrase I knew he would understand, "in that way," meaning there was something of a completely other order of magnitude. It came in that way. And therefore I know it's going to work out. "Oh," he said, "well, then of course you have to do it." Now, of course, I knew that I wasn't even trying to persuade Swamiji. I was actually just answering his objections because I did not have rational explanations, although I had some. But what I knew was I could feel that the energy was right. And I also knew that we were, and this was very important, I also knew that we were conducting ourselves in the right way because I had learned a little bit from other experiences where it was possible to pollute this. So we were being very careful not to pollute this, up to and including, "Swami, if you tell us to quit, we'll just quit." And I think that's why he was so receptive at that point. And we went ahead, and we were quite successful. And afterwards, Swami said, "I always knew this was a good idea." But he never said it ahead of time. Fascinating. So I've been on all sides of it. And what is most interesting is that Swami Kriyananda, I want to say never, he just didn't do it. Because part of getting intuition, that involves other people. You have to understand, when I was writing my books, when I was writing the book especially, Light Bearer, which was the most attuned thing that I did, it's like it was just between me and Swami. We just had to work it out, what we were going to do. I didn't really have to ask anybody. And I did. Later, I shared the manuscript with a lot of people, but I didn't accept feedback that was contradictory to my intuition about the book. I listened to see if my intuition was being corrected. I didn't get very much or any. I certainly didn't get very much that was contradictory, but sometimes people would ask why I did certain things, or I could tell that they didn't like certain things. But it had been my intuition, and it was my book. I had a right to do it. I even published it myself under my own imprinter, just because it was my statement. I didn't want anyone else to have to live up to it. It was just mine. But in these other circumstances I described, it was It involved everybody. There was just nothing I could do. I couldn't pull it like that. So Swamiji would often have intuitions that involved all of us. And he would work let me just go back, writing his own music, writing his own books, he could do it however he wanted. And when people would make suggestions sometimes about how this writing should be or how this melody should go, especially music, he would almost always say, no, that's the way it came to me. It has to be that way, because that's the way it came to me. He just had the right. They could have an opinion, but he had the right to say intuition. But when he was doing things that involved the whole direction of Ananda, I believe he never did anything without a direct call from Master to do it. But he never justified it on that basis. He would win us to it. And if he couldn't win us to it, he wouldn't do it. I mean, sometimes he had to be strategic. When he decided in 1975 and 1976 to carry on this political action campaign in Nevada County in order to get the incompetent planning director fired so that Ananda's master plan could be approved, Swami saw the politics and the human nature of the whole thing and realized that Ananda, unless we were able to get that woman replaced, which the grand jury had already told the county supervisors to do, there'd been a grand jury investigation of this woman's incompetence, and the Board of Supervisors had refused to act. So we weren't coming in from nowhere. We were just trying to inspire or force the county to act appropriately. And as it happened, our well-being was also at stake. But many people in the county were being tortured by her. And it was so out of sync with anything that Ananda had ever done before that there was this huge pushback from the community. And most of the key people at Ananda just didn't want to have anything to do with it. So he appealed to me to help him, and he wrote this up even in his leadership course later. He appealed to my sense of humor, because he knew that I would do things if they were amusing. I don't know how else to put it. He characterized it as a madcap adventure. Those were his actual words. And he said, but in actual fact, he was quite serious, because later when I just wrote a little story about that event, and I emphasized the humorous side of it, he wrote back to me and he said I was dead serious about that. He said it was extremely important. Ananda had no future unless we succeeded. He said, I characterized it that way for you because I knew that I could get your support then. So he was strategic, and he got me involved by downplaying the seriousness of it to some extent. Truthfully, I just did it because he asked me, and because I figured if he wanted to do it, he knew what he was doing. I just didn't feel the need to have my own opinion. First of all, I had no basis for my own opinion, and I just didn't feel the need to have one. If he wanted me to do it, fine, I'd just do it. And I'm an enthusiastic person. I was able to get a few others involved. We never turned the tide of the community opinion, but we got it done. But in that case, he knew it had to be done, even though he couldn't quite win everybody. He could win enough people, starting with me, in order to make that one work. So there's different ways that you work with it. You don't just quit if other people don't see it. But if you make an egoic weapon of your superconscious intuition, you've already corrupted it. You see, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Sometimes, on odd occasions, Swamiji would ask our advice, which was a little confusing to me, most notably when we were literally in the middle of a deposition, in the middle of the worst part of 12 years of litigation that we went through, and Swamiji was going to be forced to testify about very personal matters that Master had told him never to talk about to anyone. And if he didn't testify in this deposition, he could be charged with contempt of court, and he could have ended up in prison. And so we take a break and we go out and sit down to have lunch. And Swami says to the little group that was there, "What do you think I should do?" And we all felt that he should testify, because we felt he'd proved his loyalty to Master already. Just because Master had told him not to, it didn't mean that instruction was forever. And afterwards, someone said, "How could you possibly turn a decision that important over to us?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't." He said, "I had a strong feeling. I said, I knew what I should do, but I was testing my intuition," which was a very interesting way to put it. I was testing it. He said, to see if any of you could think of something that I hadn't thought of. And then I realized there'd been a number of other occasions where Swamiji had, in a very, and it wasn't a pretense. He was in a wholehearted, open way. If this is true intuition, I don't have to protect it from other people's opinions. If it's true, it's true. Others will see it, or their comments will reinforce my certainty one way or another. And in all cases where that was done, we weren't able to think of objections Swami hadn't thought of. And in the end, we all talked ourselves into the point of view he already had. But he did not start the discussion by making it like if we opposed what he was suggesting, we were on the opposite side from God. And see, that's what you do when you say, Master said so, Guru said so, God told me. I'm not sure, I think I might have told a story about a friend who took a very unpopular decision, and he justified by saying it. He felt that God wanted him to do this. And of course, I knew him. He wouldn't have done it if he hadn't felt guided. But a lot of people thought he was making a mistake. And I suggested to him that he not silence debate by making it a question of, if I disagreed with his decision, I disagreed with God. That's kind of not exactly an equal playing field. And also, it completely cut him off from anybody's input, which is also not a really bright thing to do, because God can use anyone to give you his next instruction. All of our inner guidance does not necessarily come from inside us. Sometimes it's someone else who articulates it, and as soon as they say it, you recognize it. Oh yeah, that's exactly right. And if we just cut ourselves off to our own voice, then that sneaky subconscious guidance can often just, put on a mask, and there'll be nothing else that can touch it. So another aspect of superconscious guidance is that you're at ease about it. I mean, whether you tell everyone how you handle it, everybody's different in what is appropriate for them. But the principle is, and Swami often had to work with me on this, he would say, truth is truth, Asha. It doesn't need you to defend it all the time, meaning defending it against the honorable people who are trying to help you. If you make the conversation into a debate every time in which you just keep asserting your reasons why you're right, first of all, it's obnoxious. And secondly, you don't get feedback. You limit yourself to what you already know, which is not a bright thing to do. It's not a very successful method for leadership. Let me just think if there's anything more before I open the book. I think that's the story. So Swami says, to demand agreement on the strength of your intuition alone, however, would be to bludgeon your subordinates into mindless obedience. Well, that pretty much says, took me 25 minutes to say the same thing, but that's exactly it. To bludgeon your subordinates into mindless obedience. I mean, that's nice if, you're just never going to see them again and never have to do another project. You just get your way and then take your marbles and go home. But if you're trying to build a long-range relationship, nobody likes being bludgeoned into mindless obedience. But I have an intuition, and you don't have the intuition, and you don't have my intuition. But Swami, I think he says it in here, I've always quoted it, to claim access to information that no one else can get is the last recourse of a weak leader, desperately trying to hold his position. And if you listen closely, if you watch people who are insecure in leadership positions, you'll see how often they do it. Well, I talked to so-and-so and I know what he said. I meditated and I got a message. Well, I was able to translate from the original Swahili and you can't, so I know what it said. So therefore, nobody qualifies to comment. That's bludgeoning them into mindless obedience. You may be perfectly right in what you feel. They may know, too, from experience that you are probably right. That's an interesting quirk on it, isn't it? Nevertheless, if you want to develop them into a team of discriminating and cooperative co-workers, you had better find some means of persuasion that they will be able to understand and relate to. See, this is where Swami was a master. Swami's real objective, and of course he was a spiritual teacher above all. Well, he was a spiritual teacher, full stop. Everything else followed from that. His single intention was to help each of us come to God. And everything else that we did and everything else that he did was for the single purpose of bringing others to God. Writing music, writing books, founding communities, but especially and completely, he was trying to build us into a cooperative and discriminating team. One, because we would then be more effective in what he was trying to do for Master. Having a cooperative and discriminating team would greatly expand his ability to serve. And that was what he was there for. But the full stop was, it was what we needed as human beings to develop. And his loyalty to our highest welfare, that's pure love. That's what love is. Swami says earlier about, excuse me, I'm confusing different texts here, but the fact that I'm also been doing an audio book of Hope for a Better World, and so there was a long discussion about how love is the most powerful tool that a leader has. And when we're talking about love, we're not talking, oh, hello, sweetheart, I'm so glad you came today. It's not that kind of love. It's profound, elevated, refined, self-sacrificing, I am here for your welfare. That's what love is. And it's what makes a spiritual teacher, is because their love for us is unconditional and their interest in us is for our highest well-being. But any leader on any level can express that. And one of the ways he expresses it is by not taking advantage of the power of his position, by finding a way that we'll be able to understand and relate to. Even if you feel strongly impelled from within to a certain course of action, it is better to speak of this impulse to others only rarely. Wow. Even if you feel strongly impelled from within to a certain course of action, it is better to speak of this impulse to others only rarely. The rest of the paragraph, it says, instead, offer them sound reasons. But that is so different than the way many intuitive people think that they should work with their intuition. They think that, well, everybody needs to know that this is my intuition. But why is that? It's like, instead, offer them sound reasons. And this is where we're about to go, and this will go in the later sessions for this week, which is that intuition and common sense work together. Some people have the false idea that intuition and common sense are antithetical to each other. And that is one of those, let's see, in the book of Money Magnetism, Swami had this marvelous phrase, muddy thinking and feeling leads to chaos. And this is one of those things where it's muddy thinking. It's not evil thinking, it's just muddy. The implications of it. You think, well, if I'm intuitive and I act from intuition, everybody should know that, because then they'll have more faith or whatever. But it's muddy thinking that has implications that are not wholesome, which we will explore later this week. God bless you, my friend.